Chapter 6, Section 2. The first question said, describe one way that the British increased its control over the colonies. And like we mentioned in class, after the Stamp Act was repealed, the King passed the Declaratory Act, which basically said, I have the right to tax you anytime I want to. Even though I just got rid of the Stamp Act, I still have the right to tax. And so it wasn't a tax, the Declaratory Act. It was just stating his supremacy or his power over the colonies. But the problem is they still needed money. So that's why they passed the Townshend Acts. And so that's how there's two reasons how they increased their control over the colonies. So, discussion question, why did Britain pass another tax onto the colonies after the Stamp Act failed and was repealed by Parliament? You could say that with the Stamp Act repealed, Britain still needed to raise money in the colonies to pay for the troops and other expenses. They still had that financial obligation. So Britain's Finance Minister Charles Townshend proposed a new series of duties or taxes on imports to raise revenue in America. The Townshend Act had two parts. The first part was a tax, and that was on glass, paint, paper, lead, and tea. A duty is a tax on an imported good. The other part of the Townshend Acts was the fact that the British gave writs of assistance or search warrants, or basically the tax collectors had the right to enter homes and businesses to search for smuggled or illegal goods. This made the colonists very upset. And number three said, why did it anger the colonists? Well, the colonists felt that only their locally elected officials should make laws and impose taxes. It wasn't about paying the taxes. It was about having a say in paying and how much to pay. Like I said, an act places duties, which is a tax on imported goods. And the other thing is the search warrants or the writs of assistance. They believed that it was invasion of privacy and that they were losing control to a tyrant. We talked about the Sons of Liberty. There's also the Daughters of Liberty. They started to help and protest the Townshend Act. They were women formed their own protest group, and they urged colonists to weave their own cloth and to use American products instead of British goods. So they were kind of helping behind the scenes, where the Sons of Liberty were more out in the front and doing the actions like the Boston Tea Party and actually going to get involved with the fighting that's going to take place. All right, Boston Massacre. It's called the Boston Massacre. It's really, that name is maybe not depictive of what really happened. Basically, it was 1768, and there was a lot of British soldiers in Boston. And with their arrival, there started to be some tensions because they were patrolling the streets. They felt like they were being watched, and so eventually violence is going to erupt. In 1770, a group of colonists, mostly youths and dock workers, surrounded some soldiers. They started to exchange words. They started to call them names and actually started throwing snowballs at them. When the soldiers were being hit with snowballs, the story is there was one of them had a rock inside the snowball, and one of the soldiers got scared, fired this weapon, and it was like a chain reaction. It was over in seconds, but there were 5 colonists that were killed, including Crispus Attucks, who was a freed African American. This is the last question, number 10. It says, explain the impact of Paul Revere's etching. An etching was how they would make a poster or a picture and reproduce it. And in this etching, you can see that the colonists are basically being attacked. You don't see the colonists egging them on or starting the riot. And so this impacted the colonists because they saw this as an attack from the tyrant or the king and how unfair this was. So this made them mad. This is a form of propaganda. And it helped fuel anger in the colonies. John Adams. First time we're going to talk about John Adams, who's going to be our second president. John Adams is going to be the lawyer who actually is going to defend the soldiers in court because they are charged with murder. He believed that everyone, including the British soldiers, was entitled to a fair trial. He didn't support the British, but he believed in the law and everybody should have a fair trial. He wanted to demonstrate that everyone was subject to the rule of law, and he took the case, and he actually is going to win. Two of the soldiers were found guilty of manslaughter, but nobody was charged with murder. The Boston Massacre would stand as a symbol of British tyranny in the colonies. So they're going to use this, like that etching, as a motivation to declare their freedom and independence from the king. So what happens to the Townshend Acts? Well, they repealed it in 1770. Again, because of the boycott, they weren't making money. It worked again. This is the second time it worked. They kept the tea tax to show they still had the right to tax. Now, the tea tax made them angry because that was like the national beverage. Everybody drank tea, and they felt it was if they can tax my tea, what else are they going to tax? So it was kind of an insult to the colonists. And they also passed, this is separate, the Tea Act. The Tea Act was not a tax. The tea tax was part of the Townshend Act. The Tea Act said that you could only purchase tea from England. Now, it actually made the tea cheaper, but they didn't want to be told what to do. So it forced the colonists to purchase tea from the East India Company. It lowered the price of tea, but they still were not happy about this. And so that's why they decided to have the Boston Tea Party. What role did the committees of correspondence play in the colonies? Colonial leaders understood the importance of uniting, and so they had to come up with a system to communicate with each other and also to keep an eye on the British. And so Samuel Adams urged many towns in Massachusetts to establish the committees of correspondence to communicate with each other. It was kind of a one-horse, someone would jump on a horse and ride to another town, and it was secret messages and communicating with each other. All right, the Boston Tea Party. Basically, the colonists disguised themselves as Native Americans. They went in the harbor and they dumped 342 chests of tea. Today's value would be millions of dollars of tea into the Boston Harbor. Now, what prompted it was the Tea Act. The Tea Act, again, was not a tax. It was basically they had to buy tea from one company in Britain. The colonists offered to pay for the tea in the Parliament. They offered to pay for the tea. Parliament repealed the Tea Act. Now, I want you to notice, Stamp Act, Townshend Act were both repealed because of a boycott. Now the colonists are getting active, and they're using violence. The king is not going to respond to that. They ruled out any compromise, and they're actually going to tighten the control on the colonies. And this is going to lead us to more open rebellion.